So thanks for coming along. So my name's Giles Davies and I work for Microsoft in the UK, the Visual Studio team. So it's a small team. Richard here is also in that team as well. And we cover Visual Studio and all of its associated tools, of which Team Foundation Server is a part. I've been at Microsoft about just over 5 years now, actually. I've worked for a variety of companies before that, and I guess in source control terms, I've used probably the usual variety. So I've in no particular order, Visual Source Safe, CVS, Subversion, ClearCase, TFS, obviously, all these kind of guys. So I've seen a few different sorts and trials and tribulations with each of those. So what I wanted to look at in this session, I guess Harry Hill style, with apologies to him, but there's only which of Git and TFS do I prefer? And there's only one way to find out, but not a fight this time, but actually let's go through steadily and have a look at the different features and how we support those. So what I want to do is just take a walk through and see what we're looking at. Since a lot of you know Team Foundation Server, but I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but just to set the scene. What does Team Foundation Server really provide? For a lot of people, a lot of developers will start using Team Foundation Server for version control. And that's obviously the thrust of what we're talking about today. But what it's adding around that is a number of integrated areas. So things like agile planning, which has really been in since about the 2012 release. There was some earlier stuff with spreadsheets, but that was really baked in 2012 and onwards. Testing has been a very important area for us since 2010. Build has been there from fairly early days, but has got better and better over time. We've just added in release management, and we've also had a long run of reporting. So it's about what else can it provide around that, and that's what Team Foundation Server is providing. But what we're going to talk about here is version control, so I will come back to how Git works inside Team Foundation Server. So we'll touch on some of those areas, but the focus of what we're going to go through today is the version control aspects. So what I want to talk about here really is a little bit of history, both of version control systems and TFS. So TFS itself has got a centralized version control system, as I'm sure you're aware, and it's essentially client-server. So you've got whatever client, typically Visual Studio, the server side, which is Team Foundation Server. And initially, Team Foundation Server followed what's called a check-in, check-out model. So you literally just, I check out some code, I work on it, I check it back in again. That has latterly, initially that was all that was available in TFS, but that's latterly been what's called a server workspace. Sort of examples of how that would work, not always true, there are different ways of working with ClearCase, like dynamic fobs and things, but that's kind of how things like ClearCase traditionally worked as well. It's that I've got a file checked out, and I'm effectively locking that to some extent as well, or can do. Strengths for that is scalability. So it never ceases to amaze me the scale of some of the projects that we see in Team Foundation Server. They are very exceptional, but I've seen one being bandied about at the moment, which is 40 terabytes of source code and assets that people are putting into TFS. Our own development division, the source code, the entire source code repository for everything in developer divisions, that's Visual Studio, TFS, all the languages, the lot, is somewhere around 17 terabytes. So all of those sit in Team Foundation Server. So it scales to very, very large sizes. Not typical either, but very, very large sizes. Other strengths of that is you get very fine level permissions. So even down to individual files, you can say that this file can be checked in or can't be checked in by this individual or these groups. And you also get a great deal of control and monitoring on it. So if it's important to you to know who has got what file checked out, then that server workspace model can be very, very important. You can actually see that this named individual has got that file checked out and do something about that as well. Well, does that suit? Well, I've just mentioned them, but large, and I mean large, as opposed to, oh, that's quite big. I've got a few tens of meg or even gigs, but big stuff, it definitely suits. And where you have a requirement to control and audit to that level. So that will obviously depend on sort of culture and the kind of organisation, the project. If it's in certain sectors that might be required, Mostly that kind of level is probably not mandatory, but it will depend. The other model that TFS offers is what's called edit, merge, commit. So that's a slightly looser approach. It's more like CVS or Subversion. So that's where I can go and edit those files, but I don't actually have to lock them out, and it's not that kind of a formal process. So you can have multiple people editing the same file or files, and you resolve that at the point at which you check those in. So you may have merges and merge conflicts. And that's provided by what's called a local workspace. And you can choose in TFS now between a local or a server workspace. So you can choose which of these approaches, and you can switch between them as well. And I'll show you that briefly as well. Strengths of this, well, one of the things we really improved with local workspaces was the ability to edit outside of Visual Studio and outside of that, the tooling that understands it. So that you're not completely disconnected from Team Foundation Server. It doesn't just throw up its hands and go, I don't know what's going on, it's broken. It'll understand that you're editing it. When you reconnect, it'll cope and put that back in there. So what does that suit? Probably more sort of medium, traditional size projects, and where you want that suitable balance between a level of control, but that you don't want too much friction for the individuals in the team when they're working on it. So where I want to start is, let's just start with a quick look at that before we move on to Git itself. So I'm going to come out of these slides. Let's come into Visual Studio. I haven't got any solutions open. Let's come in here, and I've got a Team Foundation server project using, I'll explain this in a minute, Team Foundation version control. One of the nice things here is we now show, this is nothing to do with what I'm going to be talking about today, but you can now see solutions that are picked out from source control. So if I go and open up something like this particular solution, I'm just opening that up. It's not very exciting, but I've got some stuff sitting inside here. Here we go, just a little hello world. And I can start to work with this. So kind of things I want to show you, if we just go into source control, kind of features you've got here, and we'll look at some of these in Git as well, so we'll compare and contrast to some extent, is I've created some branches in this. But before we get into that, we can go in, obviously we can do the usual stuff, look at history, we can go and have a look at change set details, so what files were checked in, what were they associated with. There's a sort of level of detail that we can get to. And I can also go and track change sets. So I can see, let's go and visualize where these have made it into which branches, and let's go and have a look at that across time. So when did these actually get into which branch? So we fixed that bug, did it ever make it into branch X kind of thing, those kind of discussions. So I've got all that sort of tooling to help around that. So nothing new in this, by the way, for 2013, but just the sort of standard tooling. So kind of things that are key for this is if I go back to the solution, if we just go in and open this up in File Explorer and just dive down into whatever the file is, the hello world.cs. If I go into the properties for that file, you'll notice, as I can be familiar to TFS users, is attributes. So because this is a server workspace, the attributes of those files are managed by the workspace. So if I come in and just start editing that, then it'll get confused. I can turn off the read-only attribute, but it won't be tracking it, and you'll need to tell it, and it gets a little bit confused. So there's a great deal of control that's being placed on that. If I come back in here, let's go and have a look at, let's go and just visualize the branches again. We can go and have a look at the structure. And what I might also want to do is go into, say, security, specific to either particular branches or properties around those branches as well. So there's a lot you can do with this, where you can say, well, actually, this is what this branch looks like, where it comes from, who's allowed to work on it. You might have a release branch, for example, that's very locked down, and a development branch that isn't. So there's a great deal of control and flexibility on that. So what I want to do here is if I simulate, so I'm running on a machine, I've got TFS running locally on that machine. If I simulate breaking the network connection, so if I go into the IIS manager, what I'll do is if I just stop the TFS website, that will disable the web services that is effectively the API between between Visual Studio and TFS. So if I just go and stop that, I'm just bringing down the website. But as far as Visual Studio is concerned, if I now go and try and communicate with TFS, that should be game over. It'll try, and I'll get some sort of, there we go, the source code explorer is gone. This is probably just retrying, then it'll come back with a whatever the message is, just to say that it's lost it. So as soon as I've lost that connection to Team Foundation server in that mode, that's it, it's gone. If I go back in and let's just restart that. Give it a second. Try that again. And we should be back and okay. But we've got that obvious fragility between with a network connection. So in some cases that's not an issue, in others that may be, but be aware of that. So what I want to look at, okay, it's all coming back to life. So we've got that heavy dependency on the network connection. So what I want to look at here is if I go into my workspace and if I go and edit this workspace and just go into the advanced options, there's a few things you can do here. But the thing, let's just zoom in, the thing I just want to look at is let's convert this to a local workspace. So let's move it to that other, that edit and merge scenario that I was talking about. So we'll change it to local, say OK, close, it's doing its thing I think. There we go. So we changed the type of workspace now for this. So this is a different workspace in effect. So if I come back in and just repeat this, go back into the File Explorer, let's go back down into that file. What we'll see now is that we no longer use attributes. Because it's a local workspace, this doesn't track it in the same way. So I'm now free to, let's just come out of that. I'm now free to edit this however I wish. So in fact, if I come in here and say I'm going to open this up with Notepad, and we'll come in, oops, let's put that in, I might have tidied up a comment. I can change this outside of Visual Studio. First of all, I didn't have to do anything. I don't have to change any attributes. Visual Studio is picking up the fact that the file has changed. What I can also do is if I come back into Team Explorer, and if I come into pending changes, we'll see that that has been picked up automatically. So it's tracking what's going on inside the local workspace, even though in this case I did it outside of Visual Studio, and I won't repeat it, but in fact if we lost that network connection, if I repeated that, it would still track it in the same way. It just we wouldn't be able to check it in back to the server. A couple of other things just to be aware of is you may just about be able to see on here, there's a little green sort of diagonal or triangle on there. That's the Shell Explorer for Team Foundation server. So there is a command line and there is a Shell Explorer which is part of the Power Tool. So if you want to work with or from Windows Explorer or the command line, those sort of options are available as well. But that's kind of sort of recap on status quo, if you like, around Team Foundation server. So let's have a look at where Git comes in alongside this. Well, we've got a whole new category of thing, of source control repositories, which is distributed version control systems. So not just Git, but there are others, Mercurial, Bazaar, there are some other ones as well that exist out there. Key differences here, well, you've got a completely offline experience, so we'll have a look at this. But the difference is that it's a totally different concept. So there is no master copy that's kept on the network server or a network server somewhere. You've got the entire repository locally, and you choose when and if to synchronize that with another repository in some way. So it's a totally different approach. One of the interesting aspects of that is that gives you a completely portable history. It means that all of your changes, you're doing all of your work locally. So that when you take that repository and either synchronize it with another one effectively or move it somewhere, you are moving the entire history. So it makes that kind of portability and how do I lift and shift much, much easier if you're using DVCS. I'll go into this in more detail, but branching is often seen as one of the killer features for DVCS. It's a totally different approach, and we'll look at the difference there. So who does that suit in comparison? Well, probably if you're looking at modular code bases. So it doesn't, for various reasons, it probably doesn't scale, or it doesn't scale as well to very large projects. And that's because of the way it refers to the files that it's tracking. It doesn't scale as well, but if you can modularize your code base, that's absolutely fine. Again, I'd caveat that with we're talking about quite large code bases, and normal applications probably don't need to worry about this at all. But if you're talking about the bigger stuff. It came out of Linux, so Linus Torvalds, when they lost the license to something called BitKeeper, he wrote his own, which was Git, and it suits that open source software project team approach very well. I.e., you've got a highly distributed team. They may never actually meet and work together, but you're trying to coordinate work from four corners of the world, people in different time zones, geographies, varying network connections, all that kind of thing. So highly distributed teams definitely suits. Doesn't mean you have to be at all, but it certainly suits those. And I guess a key thing here is that I would see these as, from the bottom up, is there's an increasing dependency on the proximity of the server you're talking to. So if you're using Git, I've got everything locally, literally. I do not need a remote server at all. I can choose to use one, and that's if I want to share stuff with other people or some other sort of scenarios, but I don't need it at all. If you go to the other extreme, a TFS server workspace, then I need to be, as you saw, I actually need to be connected to do anything meaningful. So, certainly one factor in this is, how am I connected to that server, and what kind of connection is it? Is it reliable? Is it a wet piece of string? All that kind of stuff. Those are going to be factors in there. Do you want to work meaningfully and track changes while you're on the train? That kind of thing. Then those might be decisions around this kind of thing. So how does Git work? Well, I'm not going to try and cover all of it, but just a really quick touch into a little bit of Git and some of the stuff I think that's important. So first of all, because it's such an important concept, it's worth going through. Because you have the entire repository locally, we need to track these slightly differently. So what you're looking at is, if I've got a repository and someone else has a repository, they're entirely separate, but perhaps we started at the same point. If I go back one, we started with the same copy, if you like, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. We started at the same point, but then we're diverging. We're both working on it. Mine, I go off and make a change. They go off and make a change. It may or may not be equivalent. I actually branch a bit, and then I merge back and I bring that change back into the fold. So I've got a series of changes. Someone else has got a series of changes. Those are entirely independent because these are two separate repositories. So a couple of things that are important about that. I only mention these words because I don't feel the need to be particularly nerdy, but they are mentioned in Git, so things like directed acyclic graphs, they will come up, DAGs, but the key point of this is you effectively can only keep moving forward. So what you're not allowed to have is that number 3, which is the grandchild of 1, cannot end up being the parent of 1 as well. So you can't have cyclical relationships inside that version tree. So there are some rules about this. Other things that are important is, well, I've simplistically put in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but actually how can that, and that's what we do in TFS, is again, slightly odd terminology, but it seems to be the in vogue phrase. That's called monotonically increasing. I've just called it a sequence, but you can't do that with a distributed version control system, because I may have made some changes, you may have made some changes. What happens if we both try and bring together change 4? Or we may well both have 4. So it just doesn't work that way because we have no server to track that. So the way Git works is it actually uses this SHA-1 hash. It's a cryptographic hash. It doesn't mean that the code is encrypted, actually. All it is a very secure way of understanding whether there's been a change to the source code. So the SHA-1 hash, which is 40 bytes, 40 characters, that's used to track these. And what you end up with is a 40-character commit ID. And that's generated on every repository. And this is simply down to probability. I did read a good analogy. It's extremely unlikely that you'll clash, to the extent that I think if everyone currently alive on the planet committed, I think it's several million lines of code a day for something like 2 years, there would still only be a 50% chance of a single clash. So if all 7 billion people were doing that, it's very low probability of clashing on a commit ID. But basically these are entirely independent because there's no central server. So you end up with these SHA-1 hash IDs. They can be a little bit off-putting to look at, I think, because there's just 40, it's a hexadecimal code, 40 characters. That's not the easiest thing to remember. Go, oh yeah, I'm just going to fit, when I check that in, it was blah, 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 and roll off that 40 character hexadecimal string. In reality, by convention, they're mostly restricted to the first 7 characters. Within Git itself, I think it requires you supply at least 4, and then as long as there's no clashes, it'll identify the unique one. You'll see this within Visual Studio. We picked that up as well. Interesting comment I heard from someone inside our development division is that we've actually got into the hundreds of millions of TFS commit IDs. So actually, they're a similar length, actually, in a very large project that's been going a long time, so Visual Studio and TFS. They're actually a comparable length inside TFS. So although the numbers look big, it's just in TFS they start small with 1, actually, and go up. So you'll to begin with, you'll go, yeah, that was commit 53, and it's a bit easier, but they'll get longer as well. So track those, you'll see these numbers, but that's how to uniquely identify them. Now I mentioned branching is kind of a killer feature. Why is that? Well, so, if you compare this with TFS, and TFS is certainly not unusual in this respect, it's quite traditional. In TFS, a branch, you can branch at any point. You can branch a file, you can branch any part of that source tree. And although a branch doesn't, if I had no branches or a single branch in TFS and then I branched, you don't double the size of your repository. It is clever about it. It'll take a delta between the two. So it's not I don't suddenly take up twice as much space. However, it is considerably more heavyweight than within Git. Within Git, a branch is actually just one of those SHA-1 hashes pointing to a new snapshot within the object repository underneath it. So a branch is actually 41 bytes. It's a SHA-1 hash code of 40 bytes plus a new line, actually. So it's 41 bytes and you've got a new branch. They're much, much lighter. The other key difference, I think, is you are only ever branching the entire repository. You're not doing a subset of it. So it's lightweight, it's the whole thing. And I think this is what people see as is a very different way of working, because that encourages you to branch much more often. You're branching locally as well. You're not branching on a server. We'll talk about that a bit. You can publish them and push them up and do things, but essentially you're branching locally. So the idea is you can have a very different workflow, which is I'm working on stuff, I'll take my own branch, try stuff out, it either worked or it didn't, you can delete branches very easily, I bring it back in, merge it, etc. And there are some conventions around, you have feature branches which are longer running, topic branches which are quite short, all that kind of stuff. So, but it's not one of these cultural things, I think. It's the tool enables a different way of working, and it's a different way of thinking about branching. So why do we want to support Git, or why should we consider it? Well, first of all, I think if you look at it from our perspective, we've seen distributed version control systems on the rise. People are getting more and more interested in them. What do? Do we take the Microsoft approach and say that's fine, we'll build our own, and put that into TFS or re-engineer TFS or whatever it's going to be? Or do we look at what is the leading DVCS tool, which is definitely Git. So Mercurial is not as popular, probably was very early on, but Git seems to have very clearly taken that space. And there are some others, but they don't really figure that high as well. Interestingly, Git is also, in that world, the standard for history interchange as well. So if you want to move or migrate your project repositories between different solutions, then the Git format is increasingly being used for that. And it's also a deployment protocol. So other things, our own Microsoft Azure, Facebook, will actually use Git as a deployment protocol. How do I actually get this code deployed and out into an application? It's also a very good, strong, or has very good cross-platform support. It came from Linux. It's got good Unix support, works on Mac. I put Windows question mark because actually arguably the weakest support is for Windows. That's probably the platform where there's the least attention. It's absolutely supported, and that's an area where I think we've been able to contribute as well. So what do we mean by Git support? So let's quickly go through some of this. Well, if we look at Visual Studio and TFS, we've got the Team Explorer, which is Visual Studio's integration into your back-end server. There's the TFS source control component, effectively, which talks to the Team Foundation version control object model. I'll just explain that terminology. So for those of you that already use TFS, because we now support Git and TFS, what was Team Foundation Server version control is now called Team Foundation Version Control, so TFVC. So you'll see that, or the full form somewhere. So that inside Visual Studio, there's basically an API that's available to talk out to TFS. In TFS, you have team projects. Those team projects have the Team Foundation version control element, as well as all the other stuff that TFS provides. So agile planning, work tracking, builds, reporting, all that kind of stuff. So, and the two are linked. So what do we, and you can access that through other integrations. So we've got an Eclipse integration, for example, that allows you to access that through Team Explorer Everywhere, which is a cross-platform integration into Eclipse. There's also a cross-platform command line. So if you're on another platform, you can still contribute to Team Foundation version control. The Git approach is essentially the same. We've got some libraries, something called libgit2. Libgit, and I think there's a weird backstory around that. There was somebody who grabbed libgit years ago or something, so the name wasn't available, so there isn't a libgit1 actually, so there's just libgit2. That was just a naming problem. But libgit2 is a library which basically provides sort of the Windows API, if you like, onto Git, and that's something that we've been contributing very heavily to as part of this process. But coming through Team Explorer, that then allows you to look at team projects which, instead of Team Foundation version control, have Git as a version control repository, but still allow you to integrate with agile planning and work items and build reporting and all that kind of stuff. And that's still accessible from whatever we provide access to, so Eclipse, for example. It also means that anything that can access Git can talk to TFS with Git inside it, if you like. We're just talking to the Git repository. So that means I can come in natively, if you like, through Eclipse, or something like eGit. So I'm not using the Eclipse Team Explorer Everywhere plugin. Another important one probably for us is Xcode. So if you are looking at iOS development, we would like to put some kind of extension into the Xcode environment, but it's not open, and we can't do that in the same way that we have with Eclipse. So the Git integration is there in Xcode, so that's a route that we support, plus any other kind of shell tools and command tools. What it also means, and I'll show you this in a bit as well, is that you can have non-TFS Git repositories that Visual Studio connects to. So this isn't only Git within TFS, but you can choose whether it's Git inside TFS or not, and make a decision about that, and I'll come back to that. And that's whether those Git repositories are local or are remote somewhere, so i.e. not on your machine as well. So it doesn't matter, Visual Studio just sees it as a Git repository, basically, whether it's in TFS or not, or local or not. And those can be connected to by any third-party tools. And then the last thing I just want to talk about here is something called Git TF. This was something we brought out a little while ago, actually, which is to help with Xcode integration. But it's also, I'll just mention it in passing, it's an open source project that we created. What it basically allows you to do is synchronize a TFS, as in a Team Foundation version control project, and a Git repository. So if you're looking at how do I migrate from an existing Team Foundation server version control repository to Git, Git TF will allow you to do that. If it's how can I have both Team Foundation version control and Git on a project, then Git TF will allow you to synchronize those as well. So be aware of that for some edge cases around how do I make the most of both of these. And all that just sits inside TFS basically. So what do I mean quickly by TFS? I'll just very quickly cover this off because I just want to make this clear. Team Foundation Server now really has two forms. It's the same code base. But there's Team Foundation Server on-premise, in other words, the thing you install on your network, on a server somewhere. And we've got Visual Studio Online, which is Team Foundation Server in Microsoft Azure. So you don't have to install it, upgrade it, patch it, all that kind of stuff. It's a software as a service in Azure. Both of those support both Team Foundation version control and Git. So for the purposes of today, it makes no difference which one we're talking about. It's your preference. Is it a on-premise or a cloud-hosted version of Team Foundation Server? That's the distinction. If you're not aware of it, you just go to visualstudio.com. You can sign up for free. It's free for up to 5 users on that account. So if you're a lone developer, so I use it for my own sort of personal projects and things. It's just a repository in the cloud. And it gives me all the Team Foundation Server and Git stuff. If you go over 5, you need MSDN or subscriptions or various other things, but it's free for up to 5. You are choosing for each project between Git or Team Foundation version control. So one thing that means is you can have a private, free Git remote repository. So if you go to GitHub, they're free as long as they're open, as long as they're public. So if you've got a small team, you want a private repository that's in Azure, backed up, geo-redundant, all that kind of stuff, then you've got there's some interesting possibilities there. Or if you're just playing around with this stuff, working from home, it means you can just sign up to it and you don't need to worry about if your laptop goes, you've got effectively a backup and a repository in the cloud. And that also gives you the other capabilities like work tracking and agile planning and so on. There are some differences between TFS and Visual Studio Online. The key ones are you authenticate using what's called a Microsoft ID now, but a Microsoft account, but what was a live ID, Hotmail address, that kind of thing. You can't customize the process template, so I won't go into that now, but if you wanted to add fields into bugs and all that kind of stuff, you can't do it. And we don't have the full fat reporting, so the OLAP cube, to get your sort of actual data warehouse running. None of those have any impact on what I'm talking about today. So that there is a decision about, if you're seriously thinking, do I go Visual Studio Online or not? There are some things to think about, particularly for a corporate. But all of these are on our backlog, so they're not now rather than never. So just be aware of that. If you're interested in that, let us know. We can talk you through which is most appropriate for you. So let's have a look at how we work with Git then. So let's come in here. Let's go back to the desktop. We're back here, and what I'm going to do this time, let's come in, I'll take you a particular flow. You'll see, like anything, we could come at this different directions, so I'll take you through a particular flow through. I'm just going to create a new team project in Team Foundation Server, and we'll call it something original like a project. And I'm going to choose a process template, doesn't matter, but I'm going to stick with the default, which is Scrum, so it doesn't matter for today's purposes. The key thing here is I choose between TFS or Git as the version control solution. So this is a per team project decision, and you choose that for this. It's not a when I install TFS, that's it. I'm choosing Git or TFS version control. So I'm going to choose Git, let it complete that. Shouldn't take too long. This will be exactly the same on Visual Studio Online. It will just be happening in Azure rather than, I may create one later if we've got time and depending on how I'm doing on stuff. So, but exactly the same process, and we'll end up with the project. So, having done that, that's been done for us. Because I started that from inside Visual Studio, it's actually telling me, yeah, it's fine, I'm interested in that guy. Just want to go here. So it's telling me that I've got my A project, which is showing up in Team Explorer. The first thing it's prompting me to do is to clone that. So what it's really saying is I want to be able to basically link together the Git repository that's been created for me in Team Foundation Server and the local one that I'll be working on. So again, you don't have to do it this way around, but I'll just show you this kind of walkthrough. So cloning, really, really easy. Just click on that, and what we're doing there is basically just saying, there's the, that's the remote location. So that's inside my TFS server. And where do you want to clone it locally? So on your local drive. My source repos directory is fine, so I'm happy with that. So I'll just say clone. That's cloned successfully, that's done. And what that means is we now have a local repository. So if I go and, let's go and have a look at that. place now. Let's come in here. Source repos. So there's a project. What I've done here is I have turned on, so I can see hidden items. And you'll see there's a hidden folder, which is .git. And if we go into that, that's where Git stores all of its information, snapshots, its object database, that kind of thing. So you don't need to know about it, but inside that, basically at a folder level, it'll know that this one is now being managed by Git, and that's where all the data is. The couple of things to just quickly mention on that, if I go into settings and Git settings, let's just talk about these. First time round, or you can set these at the command line, various other things, you'll need to supply an email address. That's just the convention, the way that Git works. So whenever you commit stuff, kind of checking it in, it just tracks who you are via an email address. I've set up a default repository location, and I've also said, yes, take my image from a third-party source, so something like Gravatar. And again, these are conventions around Git, so you can see who did it, a little picture of them, and that will show up in the history and that kind of stuff. So up to you, a few other settings in there, but that you may find you have to set those. You'll be prompted if you do. So obviously not very hard, but just be aware of those. So come back in here. We haven't, in this one, we've got no code or anything yet, so let's just come in, we'll create a console application. What I'm going to do here is let's go to the same, a very important step if you're doing this, is to go to the correct location. Hopefully I'll do that now rather than when I'm talking, make a mistake. I'm going to stick it in that A project folder that we created where we cloned it. By doing that, that will identify it to Git. That all of this code is going to go into the local Git repository. I'm explicitly not going to say add to source control, it's just unnecessary because it'll get picked up anyway. So I'll leave the name, console application 1, there we go. So I'm going to add this in. If I go to my solution explorer, just zoom in a bit, you'll see that it's got the little plus sign there, just showing that this is going to be added to source control anyway. Because we've added it to a folder that's under Git control, we've hooked into that and we understand that. So it's just going to be added in. I haven't done anything yet, so the first thing we're going to do, let's go and have a look at have we got any changes. Well, funnily enough, yes, because we've got the entire new console application. So I'm going to do my first commit, so I'm going to say initial commit. The structure here, by the way, I won't do this each time. Again, there's a convention, is in Git particularly, is to say we'll actually have a short comment and then maybe have a lot more detail underneath to explain what was going on, that kind of thing. So you can have multiple lines in there and that kind of thing. I'm just going to commit that. It says that was created locally. You can see it's very quick. No network here. I don't need to be connected at all. And it's giving me commit ID, so that's that SHA-1 hash code. Just the first 8 characters in this case, there we go. And it's telling me that that's being created locally, and I'd need to synchronize it with a remote repository if I wanted to share it. But I don't need to do that. I mean, this is entirely up to me. So what I'm going to do here, let's come in and say, well, let's have console dot some serious coding today for you. So let's say hello DevWeek. There we go. I'm just going to build up a little bit of history. Save that. We can see that there's a new change in here. So I'll just say I add hello DevWeek. Do a new commit. And then let's come in, just do one more and say, let's have a comment. And say add a comment. Okay. So I can build up my commits. Yeah, okay, didn't save that. Fair enough. So I've got some commits in here. So if I go and have a look at my outgoing commit, effectively these are the commits that I haven't shared anywhere. I don't need to. So I've got some down here. So I've got initial commit, add typos, add hello, and add a comment. So they're sitting in there. What I can also do is go and have a look at my history. So I can see this information here. And at any point, I can go back to the commit details for one of those. So I've got the commit ID. You can copy that commit ID should you need to. You can copy it into the clipboard. I think it's very unlikely, probably, unless you're going to be switching and doing stuff even then, unlikely, but you can get hold of it. You can also see the parent, so you can see, well, where did that come from? Go and have a look at those commits. So you've got that history tracking in here. We're in the first default branch, which is called master by default. So that's why it just says master up there. We'll look at branches in a minute. So we'll have a little bit look at those. So I've got some stuff sitting in here. So at some point, I might decide that it's the right time to share this with other people. So I want to commit this to the remote repository. I don't need to at any particular time. This is just a choice. So let's, if I come back in here, actually before I do that, let's open up the TFS web portal for this page. So this is where I've got the agile planning and all sorts of stuff. If I go into the code area, what it's telling me is that my A project is empty, and that's because I've been just working locally. So all of those commits are local. It's giving me instructions. I can do all of that good stuff. I can copy and paste, do it from the command line. But what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to go into my unsynced commits, and I'm going to synchronize this with that remote server. Now, sync is a word that or a term that we have added. So sync doesn't exist in Git. What you actually do is a combination of fetching, pulling, and pushing. As a convenience, we put in a button called sync, and that does that for you. But the usual Git process would be, if you fetch, what you're doing is getting a copy down, but not trying to merge it. So it's available locally, but you haven't tried to merge it with your code. If you do a pull, it includes the merge. And you should do a pull before you do a push, because you know you've got the latest copy. You sort out your problems, and then you push it back. So in this case, I know there's nothing there, so it'll go through that process. So you don't need to use the sync button, but sync is just a convenience over the top of that. So this goes through that cycle. It's now synchronized it with our remote repository. And if I go back here and just hit refresh, now we've got that stuff sitting inside the remote repository. So you don't need to do this at any particular schedule, but what that means now is that someone else could go and clone this back down. You can start working on this independently and pushing your changes up over time. So let's take a quick look at what we're seeing here as well. So one thing I could do, if I said if I was somebody else, that's the URL to go and clone it. So if I'm another developer, I can go and grab that URL, clone this code down to another workstation. I can also look at the history. So I've brought in, interestingly as well, differently to TFS, I'm seeing each element of the history. Because in TFS you'd get the check-in, so all the changes you've done up to the check-in. It's, again, a different approach. All of those individual changes I've made, those will be pushed through. There is a way in Git to, it's called squash, to get rid of those. So if you don't want to see 500 different commits reflected in the remote repository, there is a way of getting rid of that. But it's quite, I think by default it's quite nice. They're probably, because of the staggering size of my code base in this example, these won't be that exciting, but those little dots there give you an indication of the relative size of those commits. So I can see that it was slightly bigger in the first one because there are a few more files, and then these are smaller because I was only updating a single file. So there's some information conveyed there. We've got different views on this. I can see the commits. I'll come back to branches, but we can see and compare different branches. What we can also do is if I go into, let's go into an individual change, I can see that's the point at which I added a comment. I can see that side by side or in line. I can add comments to a file, so I can say great use of comments, something like that, and save that and just add that in there. What I can also do, if I go to individual files, is we can annotate lines as well. And I'll maybe come back to that, but I can stick something in, so a comment, that kind of thing. We can do some lightweight stuff inside the browser as well. We can go and view this different ways, by folder in a tree. I can go and have a look at comments. I can compare different commits against each other. Do quite a lot of useful stuff in here. I can even email out the commit, so someone else can go and get a link back to this inside here. So lots of useful stuff that's buried away a bit actually, so be aware of that. Most of this is true for Team Foundation version control projects as well, slightly different terminology and so on, but that's sitting in there. So we've synchronized this up. So the next thing I might want to do is let's go and create a new branch. So if we think about it, so let's just get rid of this guy for the moment. We've got our bit of code here. I'm working locally, and maybe I want to try something out. We're going to make a change or whatever we're going to do. The way I can work with that is if I come into, come in here, go into the branches area, and I can just say let's create a new branch, and let's call it feature A. And notice that it's going to, there's a bit of checkout in Git, doesn't mean the same as checkout in TFS. What it means is switch to, effectively. So switch to that branch as well. So I'm going to create the branch and switch out to it. It's done. Admittedly, it's a small project, but it is that quick. It's very, very fast. So I'm now in here. So what I might want to do is say, well, okay, let's add something in. So let's have another line. Let's have hello from feature A branch, something like that. And then I can go through the same process. So if I come in, let's come up here, let's go and look for changes. I can say add hello from feature A, whatever's a useful comment in the commit. Committing that locally, let's come in, add in another comment, repeat the cycle, add a comment, etc. So I've got a couple of changes, yeah, didn't say, there we go, add those in. So I've got some changes that are building up on this. If I go and have a look, these outgoing commits, these changes that are available, are only relevant to feature A branch. They're sitting in there. Now there's a couple of things I can do. You may notice that we can switch branches. So if I just go and choose master branch, I can just change between these and all the information will change. You'll see it's very quick. And we've taken away inside Visual Studio all of your file has refreshed, would you like to reload it, that kind of stuff. So you're just very naturally switching between branches very quickly. So I can move between those. So if I come in here and say, well, let's do another console.writeLine hello from master branch. Oops. And let's go and commit that. So say add hello from master. Commit that in. I've now got some different changes on each of those branches. So there's a couple of things I might want to do. Let's go back to the branches view first of all and see what we've got here. You'll notice that this says that we've got one unpublished branch. Oops, sorry, tooltip in the way. So feature A is currently an unpublished branch, and that means we haven't synchronized it, we haven't pushed it into the remote repository. So it knows that, and it's just telling me I don't need to, so I'll just show it to you to show you what you do. If I want it to reach that remote repository so as someone else can see it, I can then just go and publish that branch. And that now is then made available in here. So again, if I refresh, if I come back in, let's just go back to the Explorer, I should now have the option to choose between master and feature A in terms of those branches. And if I go to the branches area, we'll see that we've got those two. Depending on which way around I look at it, it's now telling me that feature A branch is 2 commits ahead of the master branch. So I just get a visualization of kind of where we are a bit as well as looking at the history and all that good stuff. So the next thing you might want to do is, well, I've got these 2 branches. When you have branches, almost certainly going to need to merge back again at some point. So let's just go through that. So I'm going to say, well, let's go and merge. And what I want to do is, let's say, let's merge feature A into master. So I'm going to say merge. It's saying merge in progress. Just zoom in so you can see it. And it's telling me that there are conflicts. I know that because I tried to put stuff on the same line. So good. So there are some conflicts in there. So what I'm going to do in here is I'm just going to say, yeah, let's go and resolve the conflicts. Where is that? Well, I've only really got one file, so it's not too surprising it's that one. And I'm going to select that merge option. So I could just go in here and say, well, actually, I'll take the source or the target, I'll override it, I know which one is right. Perhaps in this case I don't, I need to look at them. So we're going to do a 3-way merge, and I just hit merge, come out of that so you can see it. So this brings up the default merge tool, so you can change that for something else. This is the Visual Studio merge tool. And what I can see there is that I've got that line which is hello from either feature A or master branch. So what I could decide there is actually, or maybe I do want that one, and maybe I want that one. Or maybe I want to merge them. So maybe I want to say, let's have, let's say hello from feature A branch and master branch. And then decide, nothing to do with Git actually, but I just think it's quite nice, is that you've got IntelliSense inside here as well, so it makes it a lot easier to do other stuff. So say hello from the merge tool. So I can make my decisions about what is it that we actually want to take from this particular conflict. And when I'm happy with that, hit accept merge. I then can see what I've got locally. And if I'm happy with that, I can then commit the merge, give it a name, so merge stuff. Go and commit that in, and that's another change that I can now go and push up if I want to at any point into the repository. If we go and look at something like the history, we'll now see that I've got my history of, that's where feature A is at. If I went back to the feature A branch, we'd have that version. But actually, because I've merged feature into master, that's the latest version. That's where the head is at the master version. So that's where we got to. So I can go through sort of normal cycles nicely. Again, all that publishing to the remote server, not necessary, so I could be completely offline. I can choose when to do that. That might be very periodic. So a couple of fun things I want to cover off. Let's have a look at, that's all doing stuff through Visual Studio. Because this is not our version of Git, it is just Git, any existing Git tools will work with that. So you could use things like PoshGit, which is PowerShell-based integration. I've got the Git bash shell here. So if I go into source, repos, call it a project, haven't we? There we go. So let's change that directory. Let's have a look in there. We've got a console application. If I run git status, we can see that it tells me what's going on from a git command line point of view. So these are just git command line tools. And maybe I want to do something like look at the history. So I can do that from here and come out of that, or I can refine that a bit. So let's have git log, one line, and I can see my history of stuff in exactly the same way from the command line. Or maybe I want to look at a graph form of that. So let's have a graph, one line. I want to include all branches, and I want to decorate it with the branch names. So then I get a nice little visualization of what's happened there as we've been going through that project. So all of these tools, anything, if you're a Git power user, I'll come back to what we support through the tooling, what we don't. But anything you can do with Git, you can do with Git. So you can do it from the command line. There's lots of funky stuff you can do, aliasing and all sorts of commands that are there. Other things there are, Git does provide a Git GUI. So if you want to work with the GUI, you can do that. That's no problem. And there is something called Git-K, which is reasonably popular, which is another sort of visualization of the history. So I can go in and see that's Git-K's view of what we've done just through Visual Studio. So the key point again here, I'll reiterate, is there's no we're not doing anything weird here. So you can just pick up whichever tools make sense for you, and they'll work together. Or someone else. You might have some people using Visual Studio, some people who don't. It's not a problem at all. So you can use whichever of those you fancy on that. And then I'll come back to a couple of things in a minute. So let's come back in here. So why Git within TFS? I think key point on this is coming back to that what is Team Foundation Server, and it's providing not only version control, but some other stuff as well. So what you're getting with Git as the version control solution inside TFS is Git plus some TFS goodness. So let's have a very quick look at that. So if I come back to my project that we created, so let's go back to the home page. I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but the sort of things I'm going to do in here typically would be I might start to add things into my product backlog. So we can say, we want a console application. Add that in. I want, a Windows Store app, I want an iOS app, etc. So I can start to build up my product backlog of things that we might do in this team project. At some, I can reorder these. We can assign effort. Underneath this is just a work item. So I've got some details. So I can say this is a 10 story points, and here's a detailed description, and whatever else I want to do to this. I can reorder these, keep them in a business priority order, and when I'm ready, assign that to a sprint. I can go into the sprint, and I can start to decompose that into tasks. So I can say I'll keep it really simple. So let's call it that actually. Let's do some coding, and that's going to be 5 hours, and I'll take that actually. So I'll give it to myself. Oops. Wrong machine, different username. There we go. And again, I can give it descriptions, all that kind of stuff. And of course, as every good developer will do, I need to unit test. Oops. And maybe we actually need to do some functional testing and schema work and design work and whatever else is necessary. So we'll break it down into things. Now, the reason I did that is this is just and we've got a task board, and this is the post-it notes of the whiteboard, all that kind of view. So you can do all of that good stuff, but what we're actually ending up with is work items that have a work item ID. So if I go in to do some coding, its ID is 24. So this is work item 24. So we can tie that into our commit. So if I go back in here and say, well, actually, on this one, I'm going to have yet another comment. I've got to change, so I can say add another comment. But what I can also do is just put hash 24. So what we've done, so this isn't this isn't part of Git, but what we're doing in the libgit libraries is saying if we pick up a hash number, then what we'll do is we can link that to a TFS work item. So it doesn't break Git or do anything different to it, but it just means TFS understands it. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to commit that. Yes, and save again. So if I go and have a look at that commit itself, then the key thing there is that it understands there is a related work item for that commit into Git. So it's related to that thing we just created. If I hover over that, then I can see it's the do some coding, and I can open that up inside Visual Studio and see that. So I've got that information there. So we can start to bind together these things and make sure we understand how to get the most out of the integration with TFS and Git. Something else I want to do here is, actually let's do a couple of things. Let's close that guy down. Let's go in here, I'll get the changes screen open. So let's go back to our command line. So I increase the font to make it a bit more readable. I may have made it too big now. Okay, let's reduce it slightly. So I want to show you something, just to show you how the two interact together. So if we go to the font, let's reduce that. Yeah, let's go down there. Okay, no, that's not too bad. So what I'm going to do here is I'm back in command line, nothing to commit, so git status, there's nothing happening in there. And if I go in there and let's create a file, so let's say I'm going to create a file.txt, and I'll say some text, we'll save that. If I do a git add a file.txt, as I hit that, that gets picked up over here. So again, you can mix and match with using command lines or inside Visual Studio. So that's now being shown as an included change. If I now commit this, if I do git commit -m for the message and say this is add a new file, I can do, I think it's 24, isn't it, the number? I can also put the hash into that message. It's the same thing. So if I do that, a couple of things. First of all, that disappears because it's been committed. So that's exactly the same as using the tooling inside Visual Studio. And if I go back in, let's go and have a look at the history. There's add a new file, number 24. If I go and look at the commit details, it's got the related work item again. So you can include that on the command line. and see how those changes interact with it as well. So you've got that ability to tie back. So just something that people find very useful in Team Foundation Server, just so you understand what was the context. Why did I check this stuff in? In this case, why did I commit it? Because I was fixing this bug or addressing that requirement or whatever it might be. Other examples is if I go back in the Team Explorer, is I can go and create a build definition, and again, all of this will just work with Git out of the box. A couple of small exceptions. So let's say this is console application CI build. The trigger, the one that doesn't work at the moment, I'll come back to this, is the gated check-in. And that's because it relies on a TFS feature or a TFVC feature. So it's on our backlog, but it's at the moment not available. It's the one build type or trigger that's not available. So let's say it's continuous integration build. You can choose, it understands the branches within Git, so you can choose which branches you're going to be working against. And you just need to provide the same details. So I think I've got to share on drops. There we go, yeah, it's fine. Process template, again, there are some changes. It understands if it's a Git-based project, so it knows what to do with it, but other than that, same thing, same retention policies. I can save that. That's now a CI build. Every time I check something in, it'll kick off. But to test it out, let's just go and queue a new build. It's just started. And we can watch that build and that can complete. So there are these other bits of TFS that you can then integrate into, so you don't have to have Git as a standalone repository, but still take advantage of the TFS capabilities, basically, and use that. It's just a question of swapping out the version control. So let's go back in here. So that build completed. That's good. Fine. Done. No, not that guy. Let's go in here. So what else do I want to talk about? So I mentioned this already, but let's expand that a bit. So are there any Team Foundation version control features that are not supported in our Git integration? So in other words, things that are proprietary to Team Foundation Server. So the answer is yes, you've just seen one. So gated check-in, code reviews, suspend and resume. So code reviews is when you submit a request for a code review, and you can then pick that up, you can make comments against it, add inline comments and so on. Suspend and resume is where you are switching your context. You're in the middle of doing stuff, you can suspend your workspace in Visual Studio, and not only your pending changes, but also what files you've got open, breakpoints, all that kind of stuff will get saved to Team Foundation Server. So those are examples of things that don't exist when you choose Git as the version control repository. Broadly, those are because those three that I've just mentioned use something in TFS called shelving or shelf set, and that doesn't exist in Git. However, Git has something called stashing, which is very similar conceptually. So these are on our backlog. I don't know, my assumption would be we'll probably implement those using Git stashing, and it will just be a different implementation depending on the version control solution. So again, these aren't never, these are, we don't have them today, and they're on our backlog, and we'll close the gap between the two. Other things like auditing, the source control explorer that I showed you right at the beginning, that doesn't currently work with Git as well, so again, that may be changed so that it will. We're also working on how to put in better security and auditing levels around using Git if you want to as well. So at the moment it's pretty open, you just supply that email address. We want to bind that in a bit, if you want to, a bit more closely with security groups and so on. So we may look at some future changes around that. I've kind of already answered this one, but I thought it was worth really being clear about. So if I want to do this, if I'm using Git with Visual Studio, I've got to be using Git inside Team Foundation Server. And the answer to that is no. But let's just take a look at that. So if I come back to Visual Studio, let's go through a little bit of that. So if we come back in fact, if I go to this configuration area, what we're looking at here is it's telling me what team projects I'm connected to, and you can also see down here what local Git repositories do we have available. So different ways you can create these. So what I'm going to do, I can create a Git repository directly from Visual Studio. This is a local one without TFS. So again, what it's doing here is saying in my default location, so source repos, do you want to create one? So I'm going to say local, or let's say new local repo, create that, done. Okay, so not hard, very straightforward. If I go and have a look at that, so let's go back in, users, GDALI, source, repos, new local repo, and there's my stuff. There's the Git hidden directory. That's been created for me. So that's very straightforward. What about if I want to do it myself? Well, that's fine. If I go back upper level and let's make a new directory. So let's say it's another local repo. Okay, so let's change to another local repo. Now at the moment, if I go back in here, all I've done is created a directory. Could have done it in here. There's nothing in there. So what we'll do is we'll just do it the command line way, which is just git init. So that's now created a Git repository in that folder. If I come back in here, we've now got that hidden Git folder, excuse me, and that's sitting inside there. So at the moment, the only difference here is, so I've created it, they're identical in terms of what's in them. The only difference is that at the moment, Visual Studio doesn't know about it. So we've got this add option in there. So I can come in and say, well, actually, I'd like to add this in, so I am aware of it. So let's do that. Let's go and add it. I can just browse to it. Go and choose another local repo, bring that in, add it in, and now that's another one that's available to me here. If I then double click on that, that makes it the Git repository that Visual Studio is connected to. So the we're still in the Team Explorer when we look at this, but what we're not connected to is a TFS Git repository. This is just a local Git repository. Nice little touches, because we haven't got any solutions. If I say create a new solution, wherever it goes, whatever type, project type, it's automatically put it in that location for me. So if I create another one, it's fine. I won't go through the whole process again. But I've got new code that's sitting inside that Git repository. If I go to the changes, then I can do my initial commit again. And that's all happening locally. Now, the other thing here is at some point, I might like to, if I'm working entirely locally and I don't have a TFS project, I might want to share this with a remote repository. So again, assuming you're not entirely isolated, but you want to share it with other people so they can access that code. Now, if I go to my sync area, it's telling me that I can't publish it to a remote repository because there isn't one configured, so it doesn't know about it, which is pretty reasonable. So where is that? Well, one way of doing that, and let me just see if, sorry, I had a internet connection issue earlier. That's fine, okay, good. So what I'm doing here is I've just connected to Visual Studio Online. So I've connected to my account at visualstudio.com, so zetetic.visualstudio.com. So what we did earlier was we created a brand new team project, but on my local TFS I've got running on this machine. If we just do the same thing, but this time in Microsoft Azure, so what I'm going to do is say, I need to give it a name, so let's say yet another, oops, can't type at all, yet another project, blah, blah, blah. I want this to use Git, so I've got exactly the same choices, just I've got a one-page wizard rather than spread out over several. Process template and version control. Let's create the project. Slightly in the lap of the gods, but it's usually pretty quick, so we'll just see this being created. So the only difference really for these purposes is that this is now being created in Azure. So it's not running on I haven't had to install TFS somewhere. I don't need to have it. I'm not responsible for it. It's being backed up for me, all that kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do is we'll create the project, and then we'll go to the code area, and we'll go and get the URL to publish it to. And then if you wanted to, that's when you can do it. So let's go to the project. It's being created for us, provisioned. I can go to the code area. It'll all look the same, just happens to be in Azure. And what it's telling me is that if I want to push to this, then I'm pushing to a particular location. So I'm just going to copy that, actually. It's probably the quickest way for this. It's giving me command line instructions and so on, but there's nothing in there. So if I come in here, I'm just going to paste in that URL. We can then publish. I'll do that. It's doing it. There we go. So that's been published up there. If I just come back in, refresh. So I've now got, again, I can go through exactly the same process we did earlier. It's just the only difference here is that my Team Foundation server is remote and it's sitting in the cloud. So what that means, of course, is that I can now access it from other locations. So an example of that, maybe hopefully interesting one would be, have I got the link? There we go. Let's go in here. Is maybe just may not be the case, but you may have other team members who aren't even on Windows. So here, as it happens, I've got with a very slow refresh rate, but I've got a Linux desktop sitting in Azure as well. It doesn't have to be in Azure, that's just because I'm not running it on my machine. And within here, we can access all exactly the same information. So slowly, obviously, at the moment, so bear with me. Obviously, a combination of network and something else going on. If I go into Firefox, obviously, I should say I was using IE, but that's not necessarily any modern browser for any of the stuff we've done. Okay, jolly good. I suppose it's good, actually, that the Linux part of my demo is not going very well. It's fine, so bear with me. I should open. Come on, just wanted to show you. Give it a second anyway. So, okay. I don't want to do that now. All right, forget that. I'll come back to it in a minute. But what I wanted to show you was I can connect with any other browser on another platform. We can go to the same Azure project. And actually, well, in fact, I might be able to do that still. It may just be Firefox playing up. If I'm using, in this case, okay, so that was running. Okay, something weird going on. But if I'm using Eclipse as well, again, it doesn't have to be, all right, this is all working fine earlier. Yes, okay. No, all right, I give up on that one. I surrender. That was all working beautifully when I just tried earlier, so apologies. Is I can go in on Firefox and just have a look at the website effectively for that team project. I can connect from Xcode or Eclipse, just connect to that team project and I'll see the same information. I can clone back down onto that desktop. So it doesn't matter which combination of platform and tools you're using. We've got TFS or Visual Studio Online and or Git accessible from each of those. So another couple of things, so do you want to do that? Yeah, something else that might be interesting to look at is the other possibility, I guess, is so we've gone through, sorry, don't need that, we talk, is I've looked at, we've got TFS with Git in it, so how we clone from that and publish to it. That's what we did initially. I've then very briefly shown you how you can create new local repositories, and then if you wish, connect them to a remote one. So you can create them either in Visual Studio or the command line, and then publish them to a remote Git repository. The other sort of fairly common scenario would be, well, actually, I want to start by going and getting something that is already in a remote repository. And a very common place to find that would be GitHub. Or other places like Bitbucket or something. So if I go to, let's go to here. So this is my GitHub account, and what I've done is I've forked the libgit2sharp project, or the vnext branch actually, as it happens. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy that clone URL. So again, there's nothing kind of different in this really. But what I'm going to do is if I come back into my configuration screen, go into clone, and I'm just going to paste that in, and that's going to create a libgit2sharp local repository. So I can do that. So I'm going to clone that. Just dependent on network speed, but there's quite a lot in there. So this is going to bring down, I can't remember how big it is, but a few meg of that real life project. So this is really a scenario where I suppose a lot of what I've done is where you're initiating it. But equally, as an individual in a team, you may well be it already exists, and I need to go and bring that down, and that's the kind of thing we're doing here. Now that could be from Team Foundation server, in which case you go to that code area and copy the URL. or in this case, it's somewhere completely independent, GitHub, and what I'm doing is I'm just cloning that repository down. So I'll just leave that a second and then show you, but we can see that's coming down anyway. So I'll leave it to it, but you get the idea, hopefully, and then I end up with a local repository that I can make whatever changes I want, and then go through the process of contributing back to, in this case, GitHub, if I wanted to. So we'll have a look at that in a minute. So, some other stuff. Hopefully, lovely, that's all good and marvellous. Are there any Git, so we talked about TFS features that we don't support in Git. Are there any Git features that Visual Studio doesn't support? So yes, there are. There are more than this, but I put some up here. So there are lots of tools or commands, things like rebasing, which is effectively rewriting history, a way of going back and saying that didn't really happen and this is the order it should have happened in. So some pretty funky stuff, which is frowned on if you'll then, don't do that to anything you've published, but locally you can do it and you can rewrite your own history. You can also do things like revert commits, it's kind of an undo. You can amend, so I put the wrong comment in, something like that, or a more common one probably is I forgot to include a file, or I shouldn't have included that file, so an amend. There are loads of things here, things like annotate, or also known as blame, that kind of stuff. So there's quite a lot of stuff there. The one thing I want to make really clear is all of this is available to you. All we're talking about is there the UI tooling in Visual Studio? So you can drop to the command line and do anything and a lot more than this. Stashing, I mentioned, bisecting, all that kind of stuff, you can do from the command line. So you can be a super power user, Git user. This is just a question of what does the UI support. Good news as well is that we are working on these. So where we're at is that there's a community technology preview of update 2 to Visual Studio and TFS. And that actually addresses quite a few of these ones. And even that progress with cancellation I snuck in there. That's something that doesn't exist in Git actually, and that's something that we've added in and contributed to the libgit library. So we're giving that back to the Git community. There wasn't a sort of good way of, if I've got a very long-running clone or something, of actually getting information about it and cancelling it if you didn't mean to do it. So we're not only trying to match it, but we are genuinely contributing to these projects. So a couple of those that I just want to show you very quickly. So that's still going, sorry, that's network speed, there we go. But there we go, in fact, there we go. I'll demonstrate cancelling long-running processes. So there we go, I can cancel that, which is something we've added in. If I go back to whatever I was working on, a project, wasn't it? Let's go and have a look at the history. So maybe I can go back in here, view the commit details. Yeah, okay, let's go back up here. And I can say, well, actually added a new text file, and then that amend message option comes. So that's git amend, basically. You can do other stuff. I could add in different files, but a simple example just to change the text. So that's then amended that. If I go back in, let's just go back in here, bring up the history again. I've just changed that to add a new text file. So that kind of going back and correcting stuff, that's the amend. If I equally, actually, if I go back into that one, we've also got the revert option, which is effectively bringing that back out again. So I can just hit revert. So what I've installed on this machine is the CTP of update 2. So I want to revert this. That's been reverted. So if I go back in again, let's just go bring back up the history. That's now been reverted, so it's kind of no longer there. So we are chipping away as well at the commands. Based on nothing other than a personal belief, I would imagine we'll probably never replace all of the tools because it's quite hard to put UIs around command lines with multiple options. We have a very complex or sophisticated command line for Team Foundation server, and not all of that is reflected in the UI. And some of that's deliberate. There are things it's thought better that you actually have to drop out to the command line because it makes you think about it. Things like merging, baseless merging, so you're not merging machine-related branches, for example, on the TFVC side. And I suspect that'll be the same on the Git side, that there are some things that we will I imagine, never put in there. But we're working on those anyway, so those are coming. I'll mention pull requests. So pull requests are not a Git thing; they are a GitHub thing. So, but it is a very common workflow. It's essentially I've done what I cancelled it, but I've forked a project in GitHub. I've cloned it locally. I've done some work on it, so I think I've got a good contribution. The way that the GitHub projects are managed, probably very sensibly, is you can't just go and, well, hey, I'm just going to publish that, boom, and merge it back into what other good people are doing. So the way that usually works is you basically issue a pull request, which tells someone that I think I've done something useful, would you like to come and get it and have a look at it in a controlled way? But that's actually a GitHub capability, so we don't have that, but again I know that we're looking at how we might implement that as well. So that might be there as well, yeah, at some point in the future. So my quick wrap up. Again, who's the winner? So who won out of this fight? I'm gonna chicken out of that. So the winner is. So I was thinking about this, and I think here's my decision-making process. I think I would look at, does Git meet my version control needs for this project? That's my first decision point, I think. And within that, there's quite a lot to think about. How big is it? How's it structured? How important is it to be on the network, off the network, to be able to work in a distributed fashion? So need to think about that. I've gone from, if you roll back maybe, I'm not sure, 2 years ago, I was probably very sceptical about Git. I think it was, I was thinking it's what the cool kids use, and there's a lot of command line hard stuff, and it's just maybe it's artificially macho and hard and what have you. But actually, I really like it now, and I've grown to love it. And I think I'd almost start with if I'm working on a small project, I might default to Git without thinking about it. And part of that is because of the extreme portability. I can take all of that history and just move it to another TFS server or somewhere else. I've got massive portability there, my own copies and so on. But so I'd have to think about that. Is it right for me? Do I need the control and audit? Have I got terabytes of binary files, things that Git won't handle very well? So what's the right decision? So if no, then fairly obviously I need to use Team Foundation version control if Git isn't any good for that. If Git is useful for me, my next step, I think, would be to think, do I want that other goodness? Do I want agile planning tools? Do I want to be able to link together work items with my commits so I get that contextual information in the future? Do I want to have the integrated build engine, reporting, all that kind of stuff? If the answer is yes, then I want TFS with Git as the version control repository. And if I don't want all of that stuff, then I probably just want Git as a standalone solution. So if I don't want an ALM solution, but I do think Git is the right solution for me. Visual Studio, as I hopefully have shown you, will work across all of those different varieties. So it's just a question of which one suits your needs best for that. And there's, I'm sure, a lot more thinking in there as well around other factors, but that would be my kind of approach on that. So where I'll leave it with is there are a few resources that might be useful. So the slides will be available, I think. There's that first link is on MSDN, and it's just a matrix of the differences between Team Foundation version control and Git within TFS. So it expands on the stuff I've put in the slides. What does and doesn't equate, they're not the same. This Git features in a future update, that's actually the CTP I'm talking about. So, but that's a blog post that talks about that in a little bit more detail. A little bit niche-y, but because we support Java developers with Eclipse and so on, we've also a combination of niches. If you're a Java developer using Eclipse and Team Explorer everywhere, and Git, and you're using Visual Studio Online, we've made some improvements. So that's for you. So for that, for our one reader, that's kind of there. No, it will affect a few people, but so if you're in that situation. Then there's the MSDN Visual Studio Git documentation. So that will take you through a lot of those workflows that I showed you. And if you can't remember where did I see that and how do I press that button. And then other than that, generally I hope that was useful. Open up for questions. Do sort of keep in touch. I think I'll put both on the last one actually. You can do it. There we go, bring it up, did I? No? Okay. Let's go back to the first one then. That's my home button. Going mad. But let's just go back on here. So Giles Davies at Microsoft.com or at Visual Studio UK is sort of our team Twitter alias. But that's what I wanted to cover. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that was useful. I'm very happy to take any questions if you have any. So any questions? Yes.
If you have a TFVC project and you want to migrate that to using Git, you have to start a new project and then use that tool you mentioned to do
Yes, the Git TF tool. Yes, absolutely. So yes, there isn't a sort of button where you just go in the same way that I switch local to server workspace. There isn't anything like that. So yes, you need to use that Git TF project.
Will that Git TF just migrate the source control?
Yes.
So
yeah, it will actually bring over some of the work items as well. Actually, so if you there is a way of helping with that. I should have probably included that on there. There is one of our MVPs has actually written a blog post which talks about that, actually migrating and what you can and can't cover in a bit more detail. And it's a guy called Richard Fennell from Black Marble. But otherwise, have a chat to me in a minute and I will email you a link to it if you can't find it. But he's put together a blog post on that which talks about what you can and can't do. But yeah, Git TF can bring across some of the work items, but there are some things it can't do as well. But yeah, absolutely. But it's fennel, as in the herb. So yeah, but essentially, you're absolutely right. It's a new project, a new team project that you're then migrating into. So there are, it's obviously a significant thing to do in that you're moving projects. But yes, that's the approach. Absolutely. And obviously you could do that. If you don't want to use Git TF, then obviously no problem. Just taking the current version and just checking that into Git or something. That's very easy as well. So obviously that's fairly straightforward. Yes.
I like the switching between branches within the studio. Is that ever going to be supported in TF?
That's a good question. Yeah.
Because I kind of have to open and close solutions.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I don't know actually. I have no idea. It's the easy answer. I think it's going to be harder just because the branch is a much more significant thing. So it's a heavier weight operation. So I think it was something. I think it makes sense with Git because of what branches are in Git. I don't know whether it's on our backlog for Team Foundation version control. But you're right. I'm sure there are things like that I've no doubt our development team as well when they do that sort of stuff think, hang on, why doesn't it work that way in the other one? But I don't know, I'm afraid. Actually. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
How about the VS 2012 support? How good is that?
Oh yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned that. So yeah, so to use this, so just to be clear, everything I've showed you, with the exception of the very latest things, those revert and amend and cancelling and so on, which is in the latest update, but all of that is in Visual Studio 2013. Or there's Git updates for Visual Studio 2012. So 2012 fully updated will give you the same capability. Visual Studio 2012. On the TFS side, you do need TFS 2013. But Visual Studio 2012 will work against Team Foundation Server 2013, so that's not a problem in itself, other than that you will need to either upgrade or install TFS 2013 if you want that combination. But the Git tooling in Visual Studio is 2012 with all of the updates applied, or out of the box to 2013, basically. Okay, any more? If not, thank you very much. Hope that was useful. I was asked to remind you that please complete the survey. So there's either through the app or on the website, and I'd really appreciate that. I'm trying to remember now. I can't remember if they said there was any good as a result of doing that. I can't remember actually. But anyway, so they very much would like your feedback, as would I. So thank you very much for that. And if anyone's got any other questions, then I'll be here until I get chucked out, basically. So thank you. It's not an issue, in others that may be, but be aware of that. So what I want to look at, okay, it's all coming back to life. So we've got that heavy dependency on the network connection. So what I want to look at here is if I go into my workspace, and if I go and edit this workspace, and just go into the advanced options, there's a few things you can do here. But the thing, let's just zoom in, The thing I just want to look at is let's convert this to a local workspace. So let's move it to that edit and merge scenario that I was talking about. So we'll change it to local, say OK, close. It's doing its thing, I think. There we go. So we changed the type of workspace now for this. So this is a different workspace in effect. So if I come back in and just repeat this, go back into the File Explorer. Let's go back down into that file. What we'll see now is that we no longer use attributes. Because it's a local workspace, this doesn't track it in the same way. So I'm now free to, let's just come out of that. I'm now free to edit this however I wish. So in fact, if I come in here and say I'm going to open this up with Notepad, and we'll come in, oops, let's put that in, I might have tidied up a comment. I can change this outside of Visual Studio. First of all, I didn't have to do anything. I don't have to change any attributes. Visual Studio is picking up the fact that the file has changed. What I can also do is if I come back into Team Explorer, and if I come into Pending Changes, we'll see that that has been picked up automatically. So it's tracking what's going on inside the local workspace, even though in this case I did it outside of Visual Studio, and I won't repeat it, but in fact if we lost that network connection, if I repeated that, it would still track it in the same way. It just we wouldn't be able to check it in back to the server. A couple of other things just to be aware of is you may just about be able to see on here, there's a little green sort of diagonal or triangle on there. That's the Shell Explorer for Team Foundation Server. So there is a command line and there is a Shell Explorer which is part of the Power Tool. So if you want to work with or from Windows Explorer or the command line, those sort of options are available as well. But that's kind of sort of recap on status quo, if you like, around Team Foundation Server. So let's start looking at where Git comes in alongside this. Well, we've got a whole new category of thing, of source control repositories, which is distributed version control systems. So not just Git, but there are others, Mercurial, Bazaar, there are some other ones as well that exist out there. Key differences here, well, you've got a completely offline experience, so we'll have a look at this. But the difference is that it's a totally different concept. So there is no master copy that's kept on the network server or a network server somewhere. You've got the entire repository locally, and you choose when and if to synchronize that with another repository in some way. So it's a totally different approach. One of the interesting aspects of that is that gives you a completely portable history. It means that all of your changes, you're doing all of your work locally. So thanks for coming along. So my name's Giles Davies and I work for Microsoft in the UK, the Visual Studio team. So it's a small team. Richard here is also in that team as well. And we cover Visual Studio and all of its associated tools, of which Team Foundation Server is a part. I've been at Microsoft about just over 5 years now, actually. I've worked for a variety of companies before that, and I guess in source control terms, I've used probably the usual variety. So I've in no particular order, Visual Source Safe, CVS, Subversion, ClearCase, TFS, obviously, all these kind of guys. So I've seen a few different sorts and trials and tribulations with each of those. So what I wanted to look at in this session, I guess Harry Hillstyle, with apologies to him, but there's only which of Git and TFS do I prefer, and there's only one way to find out, but not a fight this time, but actually let's go through steadily and have a look at the different features and how we support those. So what I want to do is just take a walk through and see what we're looking at. Since a lot of you know Team Foundation Server, but I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but just to set the scene. What does Team Foundation Server really provide? For a lot of people, a lot of developers will start using Team Foundation Server for version control, and that's obviously the thrust of what we're talking about today. But what it's adding around that is a number of integrated areas. So things like agile planning, which has really been in since about the 2012 release. There was some earlier stuff with spreadsheets, but that was really baked in 2012 and onwards. Testing has been a very important area for us since 2010. Build has been there from fairly early days, but has got better and better over time. We've just added in release management, and we've also had a long run of reporting. So it's about what else can it provide around that, and that's what Team Foundation Server is providing. But what we're going to talk about here is version control, so I will come back to how Git works inside Team Foundation Server. So we'll touch on some of those areas, but the focus of what we're going to go through today is the version control aspects. So what I want to talk about here really is a little bit of history both of version control systems and TFS. So TFS itself has got a centralized version control system, as I'm sure you're aware, and it's essentially client-server. So you've got whatever client, typically Visual Studio, the server side, which is Team Foundation Server. And initially, Team Foundation Server followed what's called a check-in, check-out model. So you literally just, I check out some code, I work on it, I check it back in again. That has latterly, initially that was all that was available in TFS, but that's latterly been what's called a server workspace. Sort of examples of how that would work, not always true, there are different ways of working with ClearCase, like dynamic fobs and things, but that's kind of how things like ClearCase traditionally worked as well. It's that I've got a file checked out, and I'm effectively locking that to some extent as well, or can do. Strengths for that is scalability. So it never ceases to amaze me the scale of some of the projects that we see in Team Foundation Server. They are very exceptional, but I've seen one being bandied about at the moment, which is 40 terabytes of source code and assets that people are putting into TFS. Our own development division, the source code, the entire source code repository for everything in developer divisions, that's Visual Studio, TFS, all the languages, the lot, is somewhere around 17 terabytes. So all of those sit in Team Foundation Server. So it scales to very, very large sizes. Not typical either, but very, very large sizes. Other strengths of that is you get very fine level permissions. So even down to individual files, you can say that this file can be checked in or can't be checked in by this individual or these groups. And you also get a great deal of control and monitoring on it. So if it's important to you to know who has got what file checked out, then that server workspace model can be very, very important. You can actually see that this named individual has got that file checked out and do something about that as well. What does that suit? Well, I've just mentioned them, but large, and I mean large, as opposed to, oh, that's quite big. I've got a few tens of meg or even gigs, but big stuff, it definitely suits. And where you have a requirement to control and audit to that level. So that will obviously depend on sort of culture and the kind of organisation, the project. If it's in certain sectors that might be required. Mostly that kind of level is probably not mandatory, but it will depend. The other model that TFS offers is what's called edit, merge, commit. So that's a slightly looser approach. It's more like CVS or Subversion. So that's where I can go and edit those files, but I don't actually have to lock them out, and it's not that kind of a formal process. So you can have multiple people editing the same file or files, and you resolve that at the point at which you check those in. So you may have merges and merge conflicts. And that's provided by what's called a local workspace. And you can choose in TFS now between a local or a server workspace. So you can choose which of these approaches, and you can switch between them as well. And I'll show you that briefly as well. Strengths of this, well, one of the things we really improved with local workspaces was the ability to edit outside of Visual Studio and outside of that, the tooling that understands it. So that you're not completely disconnected from Team Foundation Server. It doesn't just throw up its hands and go, I don't know what's going on, it's broken. It'll understand that you're editing it. When you reconnect, it'll cope and put that back in there. So what does that suit? Probably more sort of medium, traditional size projects, and where you want that suitable balance between a level of control, but that you don't want too much friction for the individuals in the team when they're working on it. So where I want to start is let's just start with a quick look at that before we move on to Git itself. So I'm going to come out of these slides. Let's come into Visual Studio. I haven't got any solutions open. Let's come in here, and I've got a Team Foundation Server project using, I'll explain this in a minute, Team Foundation version control. one of the nice things here is we now show, this is nothing to do with what I'm going to be talking about today, but you can now see solutions that are picked out from source control. So if I go and open up something like this particular solution, I'm just opening that up. It's not very exciting, but I've got some stuff sitting inside here. Here we go, just a little hello world. And I can start to work with this. So kind of things, so that when you take that repository and either synchronize it with another one effectively or move it somewhere, you are moving the entire history. So it makes that kind of portability and how do I lift and shift much easier if you're using DVCS. I'll go into this in more detail, but branching is often seen as one of the killer features for DVCS. It's a totally different approach, and we'll look at the difference there. So who does that suit in comparison? Well, probably if you're looking at modular code bases. So it doesn't, for various reasons, it probably doesn't scale, or it doesn't scale as well to very large projects. And that's because of the way it refers to the files that it's tracking. It doesn't scale as well, but if you can modularize your code base, that's absolutely fine. Again, I'd caveat that with we're talking about quite large code bases. And normal applications probably don't need to worry about this at all. But if you're talking about the bigger stuff. It came out of Linux, so Linus Torvalds, when they lost the license to something called BitKeeper, he wrote his own, which was Git. And it suits that open source software project team approach very well, i.e. you've got a highly distributed team. They may never actually meet and work together, but you're trying to coordinate work from four corners of the world, people in different time zones, geographies, varying network connections, all that kind of thing. So highly distributed teams definitely suits. Doesn't mean you have to be at all, but it certainly suits those. And I guess a key thing here is that I would see these as, from the bottom up, is there's an increasing dependency on the proximity of the server you're talking to. So if you're using Git, I've got everything locally, literally. I do not need a remote server at all. I can choose to use one, and that's if I want to share stuff with other people or some other sort of scenarios. But I don't need it at all. If you go to the other extreme, a TFS server workspace, then I need to be, as you saw, I actually need to be connected to do anything meaningful. So, certainly one factor in this is how am I connected to that server and what kind of connection is it? Is it reliable? Is it a wet piece of string? All that kind of stuff. Those are going to be factors in there. Do you want to work meaningfully and track changes while you're on the train? That kind of thing. Then those might be decisions around this kind of thing. So how does Git work? Well, I'm not going to try and cover all of it, but just a really quick touch into a little bit of Git and some of the stuff I think that's important. So first of all, because it's such an important concept, it's worth going through. Because you have the entire repository locally, we need to track these slightly differently. So what you're looking at is if I've got a repository and someone else has a repository, they're entirely separate, but perhaps we started at the same point. If I go back one, we started with the same copy, if you like, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. We started at the same point, but then we're diverging. We're both working on it. Mine, I go off and make a change. They go off and make a change. It may or may not be equivalent. I actually branch a bit, and then I merge back and I bring that change. I'll show you, if we just go into source control, kind of features you've got here, and we'll look at some of these in Git as well, so we'll compare and contrast to some extent, is I've created some branches in this. But before we get into that, we can go in, obviously we can do the usual stuff, look at history, we can go and have a look at change set details, so what files were checked in, what were they associated with. There's a sort of level of detail that we can get to. And I can also go and track change sets. So I can see, let's go and visualize where these have made it into which branches, and let's go and have a look at that across time. So when did these actually get into which branch? So we fixed that bug, did it ever make it into branch X kind of thing, those kind of discussions. So I've got all that sort of tooling to help around that. So nothing new in this, by the way, for 2013, but just the sort of standard tooling. So kind of things that are key for this is if I go back to the solution, if we just go in and open this up in File Explorer, and just dive down into whatever the file is, the hello world.cs. If I go into the properties for that file, you'll notice, as I can be familiar to TFS users, is attributes. So because this is a server workspace, the attributes of those files are managed by the workspace. So if I come in and just start editing that, then it'll get confused. I can turn off the read-only attribute, but it won't be tracking it, and you'll need to tell it, and it gets a little bit confused. So there's a great deal of control that's being placed on that. If I come back in here, let's go and have a look at, let's go and just visualize the branches again. We can go and have a look at the structure. And what I might also want to do is go into, say, security, specific to either particular branches or properties around those branches as well. So there's a lot you can do with this, where you can say, well, actually, this is what this branch looks like, where it comes from, who's allowed to work on it. You might have a release branch, for example, that's very locked down, and a development branch that isn't. So there's a great deal of control and flexibility on that. So what I want to do here is if I simulate, so I'm running on a machine, I've got TFS running locally on that machine. If I simulate breaking the network connection, so if I go into the IIS manager, what I'll do is if I just stop the TFS website, that will disable the web services that is effectively the API between between Visual Studio and TFS. So if I just go and stop that, I'm just bringing down the website. But as far as Visual Studio is concerned, if I now go and try and communicate with TFS, that should be game over. It will try, and I'll get some sort of, there we go, the source code explorer is gone. This is probably just retrying, then it'll come back with whatever the message is, just to say that it's lost it. So as soon as I've lost that connection to Team Foundation server in that mode, that's it, it's gone. If I go back in, and let's just restart that. Give it a second. Try that again. And we should be back and okay. But we've got that obvious fragility with a network connection. So in some cases that's